The Ducati arrival and the reset. Learning a new motorcycle at the age of 31 is not the same as learning a new motorcycle at 20. The physical adaptation is harder, the mental habits are more deeply grooved. A rider who has spent years internalizing the responses of one machine carries those responses into every interaction with a different one. The inputs that feel natural, the instincts about what the bike is about to do and how to prevent it from doing the wrong thing, all of that is stored knowledge, and some of it is wrong for the new context. Marc Márquez arrived at the Ducati garage for the first time with a reputation that preceded him in every direction. The engineers knew they were working with the most decorated active rider in the sport. They also knew they were working with a rider who would need to unlearn certain things before he could apply what made him exceptional to this new machine. The Ducati does not want the same things a Honda wants. It is a fundamentally different motorcycle in terms of engine character, aerodynamic behavior, and the relationship between power delivery and corner entry. Where the Honda demanded a certain kind of aggression, the Ducati rewards a different kind of precision. The 2024 season with Gresini Racing was, in many ways, a laboratory. Márquez finished third in the World Championship. That single statistic, when placed next to the context, becomes remarkable. He was riding a 2023 specification Ducati against riders on the 2024 factory specification. He was adapting in real time to new mechanical behavior while simultaneously competing at the highest level. There were races where the old Marc Márquez appeared with such clarity that the crowd noise changed. Circuits where he was visibly faster than riders on superior machinery, simply because his ability to find and exploit performance margins remained exceptional. He stood on the podium 6 times. He won in the wet at Assen with a masterclass in controlled aggression that reminded older fans of what they had been watching between 2013 and 2019. But what the 2024 season communicated most clearly was not results. It was readiness. Every person inside the Ducati ecosystem who observed him that season came away with the same assessment. This was not a rider managing a career in its decline phase. This was a rider rebuilding, systematically and intelligently, the foundation for a new peak. He was asking different questions than he had asked in years. He was listening to the engineers with a particular kind of attention. He was applying the kind of analytical focus to his own riding that he had previously reserved for studying his rivals. The contract announcement for 2025 arrived against this backdrop. Marc Márquez would join the factory Ducati Lenovo team alongside Francesco Bagnaia. The 2 fastest riders in the world on the same machine, the best machine in the paddock, in the same garage. If you wanted to construct a scenario designed to produce maximum drama and maximum speed simultaneously, you had arrived at exactly this one. Chapter 7. Factory Red, the Championship and the WBGR of history. The 2025 MotoGP's season began with a specific quality of attention directed at the Ducati garage. Not the general interest that surrounds any new season, but a focused, almost forensic interest that came from the fact that the 2 men sharing the garage had between them won the last 6 world championships, and that one of them was the greatest rider of his generation, returning to what everyone suspected was the most complete machinery he had ever touched. What emerged across the early rounds was a pattern that the data-minded observers had predicted and the romantics had hoped for. Márquez on the factory Ducati was not the same as Márquez on the Gresini Ducati. The specification gap mattered, the full factory support mattered, and the season of adaptation in 2024 mattered most of all, because by the time the 2025 season began, he was no longer learning the bike. He was using it. His wins arrived with the texture of inevitability that had characterized his best years with Honda, but with a technical polish that was new. He was not simply overpowering the competition on pure commitment. He was dissecting races, reading tire degradation with the patience of a rider who had learned, at considerable cost, that every competition cannot be won by simply going faster. The crashes were fewer, the margin management was more sophisticated, and on the days when the circuit conditions aligned with his specific strengths, he was producing lap times that the rest of the field could not locate on their own machinery. By the middle of the season, he had reclaimed the championship lead, and held it, and extended it, and when the mathematics finally confirmed what the eye had been telling anyone willing to look, Marc Márquez had won his 8th MotoGP World Championship. The 8th, won more than Valentino Rossi's 7 in the Premier class, a number that, when spoken in full, reshapes the entire conversation about who belongs at the very summit of this sport's history. I want to be careful here about the language of inevitability, because it is dishonest to pretend that this outcome was obvious. There were genuine moments in the intervening years where the road back did not look passable. Where the arm, the results, the separation from Honda, the satellite team Burke, could easily have been the final set of facts in a story that ended before this chapter. The outcome was not inevitable. It was constructed, deliberately and over a long time, by a person who refused to accept the narrative that the sport had begun to write around him. And what does that mean? What does it mean for the way we understand competitive greatness in sport? Drop your city and the time it is where you are in the comments. I genuinely read that. There is something about the geography of this sports audience that I find compelling. Someone watching this at midnight in Buenos Aires, someone on their lunch break in Kuala Lumpur, someone in a bar in Tabulia who grew up watching a different man hold this record. Leave it there, because what we're talking about is a story that crosses all of that distance. Chapter 8. What the record means, and the argument that never ends. Motorsport has always had a difficult relationship with the question of greatness. The parameters shift, the machinery changes, the competition evolves in ways that make direct comparison across eras genuinely complicated. A lap time from 1999 means something entirely different from a lap time in 2025 because the machines, the tires, the electronics, the aerodynamic packages are not the same objects wearing the same name. Any serious attempt to rank the greatest MotoGP riders in history runs immediately into these structural problems. And yet the attempt is made, constantly, because sport generates exactly this kind of argument as one of its core products. People need to place things in relation to each other. They need hierarchy. They need the greatest of all-time conversation not because it has a clean answer but because arguing about it is itself the point. The Márquez case is interesting precisely because of the shape of his dominance. He did not accumulate his 8 championships through longevity alone, through showing up consistently over a very long career and taking titles in years when no single other rival was strong enough to stop him. He won his first 6 in heat seasons. 6 championships in heat seasons is a statistic that shrinks the historical conversation to a very small number of participants. And he won them against competition that was real. Against Jorge Lorenzo, one of the most technically perfect riders the sport has ever produced. Against Valentino Rossi, a competitor whose blend of raw speed and psychological intelligence set the template for modern MotoGP rivalry. Against Dani Pedrosa, whose career numbers would look entirely different if the championship had gone his way in the years Márquez took it instead. The years of the injury and the return add a different kind of weight to the record. They mean the 8th title did not arrive in a straight line. They mean the person who won it in 2025 had absorbed information that the person who won the previous ones had never had to absorb. What it costs to be away, what it costs to come back, what you have to be willing to dismantle about yourself in order to rebuild. These are not lessons that make a rider less. They are, in the evidence of the outcome, what made him more. There is also the competitive context of the 2025 title to consider. The Ducati era MotoGP has produced the most technically homogeneous championship field in the sport's modern history, in the sense that the best machinery is available to the most riders, and the margin between factory and satellite packages has narrowed in ways that eliminate the kind of equipment advantage that earlier champions sometimes benefited from. Winning a championship in this environment, against Bagnaia, against Jorge Martin, against a grid full of riders on the same or nearly the same machinery, requires a level of differentiation that is genuinely hard to manufacture. Márquez found it. None of this resolves the greatest of all-time argument. That argument is not designed to be resolved. It is designed to be had, loudly and affectionately, in paddocks and living rooms and comment sections, by people who fell in love with this sport watching different eras and different heroes. What the 8th title does is ensure that any serious version of the conversation has to include his name at the very top of the list, with serious evidence behind the inclusion. Chapter 9. The man behind the helmet, what the comeback reveals. Professional athletes in the peak of their careers are, in a certain sense, incomplete portraits. We see the performances, we see the press conference composure, the celebration, the occasional flash of frustration after a difficult race. While we rarely see what the structure of elite competition actively prevents us from seeing, is what happens in the hours and days when the result has gone wrong and there are no cameras, no microphones, and no result to be proud of. The years between Jerez 2020 and the 2025 championship offer an unusually detailed portrait of Marc Márquez under conditions that strip away the scaffolding that usually protects elite competitors from having to explain themselves. 4 surgeries, recovery programs that stalled, a departure from the team and brand he had been synonymous with for over a decade. A first season on Ducati that was exceptional in context but would have represented underperformance by the standards his own history had set. People who worked with him during this period describe a particular quality. Not Daniel, not the brittle, performative confidence of an athlete who is actually afraid. Something more sustainable than that, the genuine, almost clinical ability to separate his assessment of his current situation from his understanding of his own capabilities. He seemed to know, in a way that was not delusional because it eventually proved accurate, that the version of himself the results were showing was not the final version. He was simply not finished with the process of getting back to where he intended to go. The relationship with his brother and crew chief Alex should be mentioned here, because it matters. Having a family member in that role creates a communication dynamic that is different from the standard rider-engineer relationship. There is a shorthand available between them, built over decades, that allows certain conversations to happen faster and more honestly than they might otherwise. During the difficult years, this was not a small thing. There is also something worth saying about the choice to join Gresini rather than waiting for a better offer. At the time, there was discussion in the paddock about whether a rider of Márquez's standing should accept the satellite berth. The argument against doing so was about optics, about the risk of the machinery framing his results in an uncharitable way. The argument for it was simpler and, as the following 2 years demonstrated, more correct. He needed to learn the Ducati. The best way to learn the Ducati was to ride the Ducati. A year on the Gresini machinery, even the previous year's specification, was a year in the school. And he graduated. What this reveals, ultimately, is that the qualities that made Marc Márquez exceptional as a young rider, the willingness to go to the edge, the refusal to accept someone else's assessment of what was possible, did not disappear during the injury years. They were temporarily redirected. Instead of being expressed through quarter speed and wild saves, they were expressed through the decision to have a 4th surgery, through the decision to leave Honda, through the decision to spend 2024 learning rather than winning. The application changed, the underlying person did not. Chapter 10. The open question. What comes next for motorcycle racing's most complicated story? Marc Márquez is 32 years old as at this championship. In historical terms, that makes him a MotoGP champion at an age when the sport has sometimes considered riders to be in the declining phase of their career. Valentino Rossi won his 9th title at the age of 34, though in a very different competitive landscape. The question of how many more seasons Márquez can compete at the absolute summit is one that does not have an obvious answer. What the evidence from 2024 and 2025 suggests is that his physical recovery from the arm injury is now genuinely complete, or close enough to complete that the distinction is academic. His crash rate in 2025 returned to the controlled levels of his championship years, which matters because the crash data is the most honest measure of whether a rider is managing the edge or being managed by it. He was managing it. The Ducati package, barring a significant shift in the competitive landscape, should remain the dominant machinery in the near term. The resources Ducati have committed to this program, the technical depth of the team, and the institutional knowledge they have accumulated through multiple championship cycles mean their advantage is not accidental and not easily replicated. That is a favorable context for a rider who has just completed the adaptation process. And there is the matter of his teammate. Francesco Bagnaia is himself one of the best riders of his generation, with 2 world championships already on his record. Sharing the garage with Bagnaia provides Márquez with the most demanding possible reference point. What we observed in 2025 was a genuine intra-team rivalry that produced better performance from both riders than either might have reached with a lesser internal challenge. That competitive structure is unlikely to ease, which is itself a reason to believe the level of racing it generates will remain extremely high. The record currently reads 8 World Championships. Whether it will read 9 is a question that the 2026 season will begin to answer. But here's the thing that keeps pulling me back to this story, past the statistics and the technical analysis and the reasonable projections about future performance. Every time you trace the full arc of what Marc Márquez has done, the narrative gets larger, not smaller. A kid from Cervera becoming the youngest MotoGP champion in history, then building a dynasty, then watching it taken away in a single crash, then spending years rebuilding something nobody was sure could be rebuilt, then returning not as a diminished version of himself but as a more complete one. Not just back to winning, but winning in a new context, on new machinery, against a new generation of competition, with an 8th title that the historical record will not easily accommodate alongside names that seemed, for a time, impossible to surpass. The full picture of what Marc Márquez is as a racer is not in yet. The final chapter has not been written, but what has already been written is enough to say, with confidence and without exaggeration, that what you have been watching is not ordinary. It was never ordinary, and the years when it seemed like it might be over were, as it turned out, simply the story building towards something bigger than any of the chapters that preceded them. That is where we are, the corner that changed everything in Jerez in 2020 and what it eventually produced. I record, a dissection, and a writer who, at 32, is still not finished.